Welcome to Season 2 of The Reflection. We started this series in March 2020 after the announcement of the lockdown and COVID-19 began to change the world.
For 20 weeks, academics, activists and journalists joined us to discuss everything from the UK government's mishandling of the pandemic, the growth of conspiracies, Black Lives Matter, and what it was like to bear witness to the growth of existing local and global inequalities.
For this season, our guests will be reflecting on the political climate of the past year, and we'll be talking to authors who have released books in 2020 concerning matters of race and class.
Welcome to another episode of Surviving Society's Reflection series. We are really excited today to be joined in the studio with Dr. Joy White, who is lecturer in applied social studies at the University of Bedfordshire and author of, I reckon it's probably it's my top 3 books of 2020.
I cite it a lot.
Yeah, he cites it a lot. Top 3 books of 2020 at Surviving Society. It's fully in our SS canon. Terraformed, Young Black Lives in the Inner City. Similar to other conversations we've had during the reflection, I think it would be really helpful if you're listening to this episode now to stop, if you haven't, and listen back to the episode we did with Joy.
Back.
Yeah, go back. Episode we did with Joy a year ago now, because some of the things we're going to be talking about today very much touch on and continue from conversations we had with Joy last year when Terraformed was launched. So Joy, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, and thank you for inviting me back. It feels like a very long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And when you asked me to come back and reflect on the book, and I started to think about, well, Terraformed came out in May 2020 at the start of the first lockdown. Imagine.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the first and the second lockdown, but here we go. And what was really interesting for me was that the two of you, Tissot and Chantal, you were the first 2 people that I'd spoken to about the book. It was the first discussion that I'd had. And up until I submitted it, I did the edits, you kind of go through this process, but I hadn't read the whole thing again until I spoke to you. I thought, well, they're going to be asking me things. I better, get my head in this and read all of the chapters. And so to have that opportunity so early on, the book wasn't quite out yet when we spoke. I think it was coming out in a few weeks. To have that opportunity to talk about what is, shall we say, unusual academic text. Unusual. I'm going to go for unusual. Some people have said it's strange. Some people have said that it's a very weird book. Some people have said
Who said that?
It is a weird
please,
book.
Joy.
One person said, why is she talking about town planning? She keeps talking about town planning. But then other people have said, it's one of the ones that stick in my mind is about being a potent mix of love and rage. And that's the place that I was writing from. I was writing, I think I said to you at the time, when I started writing the book, I was in a state, a kind of deep grief and wanting to know where to put it and what to do with it and trying to, connect these dots to make some of these patterns make sense. And so if it is a strange book, I accept that. I'm happy with that. The town planning, we needed the town planning, and we'll talk about that some more. And since then, until quite recently, every event that I've done around the book has been online. I had this really strange experience where I was talking to people about this book that was quite personal in some ways, talking to people that I'd never met, haven't been able to meet since. It's quite a hard feeling to describe, to talk about your work with various people. And so then what I thought I would do is let me go and make a list of what I did to talk about this book in the last year. And it was 2 pages worth. Mm-hmm. And my usual mode of operation is busy. This is exceptional, even for me. When I listed it out, the talks, the podcasts, the interviews, the articles. And I think that's one of the things that lockdown did for me. It made me really think about how I use my time. When we first spoke last year, couldn't read anything, couldn't write anything, had no creative spark. And then something just kind of switched on along the way and I just started and didn't stop. I don't necessarily think that's a good thing, however, but that's how it is. I mean, it was pretty much every month doing something around this book. Hearing how it connected with people has been, a bit astonishing in a lot of ways. I didn't know that any of that was going to happen.
Can I just suggest quickly the people that said the book was weird? Like, fuck you. Fuck you. Because the book for me, and T, I know we were sort of talking as we were reading it, as we do when we have guests come on and they were talking about their book. I cried at various times reading it. I thought it's one of the most beautiful books that I've read over the past few years. I think it very much belongs within texts like Christina Sharp, Saidiya Hartman, purposeful, poetic and loving ethnographies of life. So people that say it's weird, I'm sorry, but what dry books are you reading? I know which dry books you're reading.
Listen. You see them people there? They're not reading it in the same way.
No.
Like for me, when I first read it, as I'm reading it from like someone from the ends. They understand, right? You're telling about where you live, where I live. So you're seeing it through my eyes, right? And it's that perspective that's always been missing from academia. So when I read that, it connects to me because not only does it mix the structural things, but it talks about the way you use language. It's in a way that it's knowledge is conveyed for everyone. When most these academic texts, these dry ones that people read, the epistemologies are for like a small group of people. It's esoteric. To me, that's not good writing, man.
But I also think part of it is that they're not able to bring what scholars like Joy are able to bring to scholarship. So for me, it's just interesting that would be it's not interesting. It makes sense to me that they would say that. It's just like, you can't do this.
You see, like the chapter, Why Music Matters. You see, for me, I felt that because it does matter, right? That's like the kind of soundtrack to your life. From our point of view, from a certain age group, if you're going to raves or you're from the sound systems or from the shubs, music is key to your life. And for people that can't really understand that, well, you just haven't lived that life. But this book gives you a slice of it to show you why it's so important.
Do you know what was really heartening for me? I did my first in real life event at the beginning of July. I did it for New and Word Festival. So I did this in-person book launch. It had to be socially distanced, so there weren't that many people there. But I invited some young Newham residents to be on the panel. There were 4 of them and they came. And when they spoke about Terraformed, they said what both of you have said. They said, lifelong Newham residents, for someone to take the time and the care to write about our lives in this way, how things got to be this way, for someone to put that much effort in, it really means something. I was really taken aback. Did have to kind of steady myself for a moment. That they were these young people, and one of them actually said, thank you for writing this because you articulated what I've been trying to say for a long time, but I didn't have the words. And that was the point. That was the point. The point was not for me to speak on behalf of anybody, but to lay things out in a way so that people could pick up whatever it was they thought they needed and make it work for them. That was the point. Those of us who are from those places, we don't need people to speak for us. We need people to listen to what we've been saying all along. And sometimes we need a different language to do that. So that's what I was trying to do. And so it kind of made it all worthwhile, the kind of some of the moments about, have I done the right thing? I got asked this question a lot about the personal and academic work, about including yourself in academic work.
This question annoys me.
But it comes up a lot, and I think, how could I leave myself out?
Exactly.
How do I leave myself out of it when I'm writing about a life that is not my life, but I have been part of that life before? I'm not a young person in it, but I am in the inner city. I have lived in these places forever. I have got that foot in the past and in the present as well, because I write about contemporary Black British music, but I'm not from that generation. I'm from a different generation. So if I can't put myself in there, then what am I saying? What am I saying? And who am I saying it to? Who am I writing for? So, yeah, it's the response on the whole has been positive in places that I didn't expect it from. And the outliers, the people that demand I come and explain themselves to their writers group or whatever, the people that say, oh, you've got that all wrong, in a kind of sideways way, in a kind of shady way, or I've misunderstood certain things or haven't, then that's fine. That's fine as well. Because as I was saying to you earlier, once the work's out there, how people respond to it, that's fine with me. And it's interesting as well that other work on similar topics gets taken up in different ways.
But just saying things how it is, like you are someone that has a personal relationship with the subject matters within the book, but also you are a Black woman scholar saying really important things that we should be taking note of, and that is contributing substantially to this canonical type of work, I believe. And I think that there is something about other scholars wanting to question that. I think people just show themselves, to be honest. I'm sorry that you've had some of that, but just know that there are so many of us, like Tiso and I.
This is the whole point now. I think it's about pushing back against academia. Pushing against the discipline that wants to kind of decenter yourself. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
To me, it doesn't make sense. Like, I'm talking about stuff that I know about, right? And I'm just layering upon like the other bits I've read.
But also, I think they feel threatened by scholarship like Terraformed. I said last year, Joy's definition of neoliberalism and its impact on young Black people in the city, I think is one of the best definitions I've ever seen. I can't be the only one that's seeing it in that way. And there is a kind of an academic resistance, so our ways of talking about our lives, because it is a level that they can't get to.
And this thing about, you know, how things have always been done, whatever that is, in whatever sector, well, surely one of the many things that being in this state of pandemic for however long must have told us that how it's always been done doesn't work. We can't do things like that anymore. And what's the point of scholarship if it stays on the shelf? The scholarship, it has to be out there. It's got to be public. I'm not making any grand claims for my work, but the academic work is supposed to make a difference. It's supposed to make some change somewhere, even if it means that it changes one person's way of thinking or way of looking at the world. But if it just stays on the shelf and it's not out there in the public domain, if it's not being shared, you know, via podcasts or other means, then how do we get people to understand and interpret and critique the world that they're living in? Or do we just want to keep people in ignorance? But I think that's part of the project, isn't it? To keep people ignorant of systems and how they work, and institutions and how they work, so that we can pick out individual instances of racism, for example, and say that person is a bad person because they said those terrible things on social media. But actually, we need to look at, well, how is it all right? How did that person feel all right to say all of those things? What's at play here, and why is that okay? And why did that person think, well, yeah, everyone's going to be behind me because it's common sense, isn't it? We can say all of these things about some football players, because your sense of belonging and whether you belong and whether you're a citizen, if you're a person of colour, is wholly dependent on whether you literally play the game. And and if you don't, then everything can rain down on you. That's fine. We need to be looking at those systems as well as the individual that says the terrible things on Twitter. But not having these forums, not having these ways of getting the scholarship out there, keeps people in a state of not knowing, and that doesn't help anybody.
But I think in marginalised communities, there's a kind of hunger for this knowledge. And I suppose Bacardi's work, the idea of the mundane, to explain away this feeling. Like, I don't know what this feeling is, but works like Terraformed, like it explains, helps you to understand what that feeling is and pinpoint it and show you what the kind of structural underpinnings of it are. And rather than the alternative is when people lurch into conspiracy. And this has been one of the big pushbacks I've been getting. So, like I said, with my own work, looking at drill and speaking to people, a lot of what I come across is a lot of conspiracy. And I might direct them to your work. And because your work is accessible, they will read that. And because it's written by another black person, they're more likely to read it. But it's important to have that kind of scholarship out there. Because,
and I think, T, that's such an interesting point, because I think before our conversation with Joy, or after our conversation with Joy, actually, the conspiracy stuff has has gone through the roof, and we've been trying to find ways to kind of create resistances to that for the people within our lives, like help people like to make sense of how to come out of conspiracies. We've got conspiracies. Then we also had like black squares, corporate responses to Black Lives Matter. So we had like, so I feel like that's why I'm so glad that you've come back on the show, Joy, because there's been actually a lot of things that happened that, again, like coming back to what you just said, T, about Joy's book, one of the reasons why the definition that you give about neoliberalism is so strong is because you track that the decades and decades of what neoliberalism has done to our communities and how that's stripped back so much, whether it's welfare support, like space, education, poverty, and brought us to where we are now. And I think that, I know we were talking to Alana Lenton about this on the show a couple of weeks ago. When we're talking about young people now and their lives, we have to consider all these things that are built up to this point. We have to go back. What Joy does in the book, to where we were and how we've got here, and that's important because it's there's similarities to, let's say, the 80s, for example, but it's different because we're in this hyper. Well, you were talking the other day about the death of neoliberalism, wasn't you?
Yeah.
We're in this authoritarian capitalism.
So
we're in COVID-19, social media, like everything is. It just feels like the book was so well timed, but equally, there's so many things that have now happened post the book that it's like, do you know what I mean?
I know it's because I'd almost forgotten the black squares.
Yeah.
I'd almost forgotten the black squares.
Sorry, I'll bring up.
Yeah, there was. Go on.
You know, I was going to add, right? I think one of the things we didn't touch upon, or we didn't touch upon at the time when we spoke last time, was the advent or becoming more noticeable of black conservatism.
Oh yeah.
Right. So they would kind of see the book as not really talking to their experience, right? And because their voices resonate with what's kind of populism at the moment, it kind of downplays our lived experience, but also your analytical experience on top of that.
To sort of conclude your question/point there, T, I think that the black conservatives reading Joy's book would be like, yeah, we just need to try harder.
Yeah.
I tried harder. Look, I went to this school. I got this scholarship.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose the politics of aspiration, and so all of that work about, well, what are some communities lacking in order to go up the ladder, to be mobile? And I suppose for some people, if they take certain steps and they get to that level of success, that place that they think they should be in, that they are, then it would be fairly straightforward, I suppose, to interpret that as effort, hard work, discipline, right family structure and so on, and to not recognise luck, structures, systems, and a political setup that is not designed for people from the working classes, however they define themselves racially or ethnically. It's not set up for the working class to live good lives or succeed, especially in the last 30 or 40 years. And now it's just rampant. It's just out there. It's just obvious for everybody to see the levels of cronyism. Grab what you can, steal as much as you can, steal it in plain sight, in fact, from the people that are paying for it, and then say, oh, it's all fine, and then bring in another.
Dido Harding.
It's one from the Bullingdon Club now has come to supervise the investigation into ethics. Yeah. So they brought in another mate, another friend, somebody they went to school with, someone they went to university with, and so on. And it's just there in our face, obvious, clear as day, and somehow out of that people can formulate a story that, it was hard work that got me here and nothing else.
But you see, there's an argument saying that we've moved from neoliberalism into what we call authoritarian capitalism. So it's that kind of naked capitalism that doesn't respect the norms that we come used to. So transparency, responsible government, all those kind of things that we kind of expected.
Statesmanship.
We expected. Yeah. Obviously, right. But so given that if we're working from the premise that the rules of the game have changed, how do we fight back in those spaces where for example, where music matters, where the street, where music is formulated and it grows, where those things don't really exist as they used to, where they've changed. So, for example, if kids are making music in the online space is a corporatized space. So how does that affect our calls for solidarity?
And emancipatory politics. Yeah.
It has become, or it seems to have become, finding ways to divide people, even in those community and creative spaces and practices. So a way of keeping people apart, and the authoritarian bit of, well, if you're not doing it as I say, in the way that I say, that kind of, well, they lock them up, give them longer sentences, or take them off the street and make them stay inside, or keep them offline, or if they're allowed online, they're only allowed online in certain ways, in ways that suit us. And I think it comes back to my earlier point about, keeping people without knowledge and keeping people without that kind of deeper understanding of what's going on. And so that's when there's this kind of lapse maybe into the conspiracy type, because you can feel and see that something's going on, but haven't quite got a way of explaining it. So it is quite easy then to step into this kind of, well, there's whatever it is. It's all part of the same point. And the beauty of these discussions is that can happen, that kind of, we're going to start with this point, but then we're going to talk about this, and that kind of working it out, bringing it together, thinking deeply about things. Yeah. That's the point, isn't it? And if people don't have an opportunity or a space to do that in, then you do get these silos or these pockets of, well, someone's controlling this, or they're controlling the clouds, or there's chemtrails, or there's this, or there's that, whatever it is. You get all of that. And there isn't, without that community, that in its broadest sense, that people being able to come together and talk and share and discuss and work these things out, then how do you get to a point where you do get that understanding that actually, listen, they're playing us, they're stealing our stuff. They're literally putting the swag in it, and running out the door with our stuff, and we're watching in real time. But it's the classic, well, look over there, we're looking over there when right there they're stealing our stuff. And all of what you talked about, the rules and the norms of and the ways of operating, the so-called democratic principles, that's all getting slung in the bin as well. And we're watching all of that. Well, we're not watching because we're getting distracted by black squares, I don't know, or whatever it is.
But this is, I think what Bell Hooks talks about, the kind of oppositional gaze, right? I think as a marginalised group, we were always aware that the rules of the game are rigged. But it's about it's about kind of realising that our knowledge is valuable. So we could tell you that this game was rigged. We can tell you how it's so bad.
We've been telling you.
We've been telling you.
Yeah.
But the thing is, you're still excluding our voices, and
or you're picking the voices that suit your agenda.
I don't even
Tony Sewell.
Yeah, but even when you pick them, they're not even saying it's rigged. They're just saying it doesn't exist.
Thinking about the Black Lives Matter renewed uprisings last year, we saw a record amount of young people, families, everyone around the world sort of coming out and making the statement to say that Black lives do matter. Like, we saw some amazing movement building that I very much believe is still happening and going now. Like, that if we're just talking about some sort of more progressive utopian things that have been happening, because that has been happening whilst at the same time all this awful shit has been going on that we've just been talking about. Anyway, what do you think about our kind of histories in terms of Black community organising, but also how much death and suffering we have seen at the hands of the state to our communities, and how we have not necessarily been able to gain that kind of momentum in the past? So I'm thinking about some of the sort of portraits that you give within Terraformed about young Black men who and women, obviously, who have been killed by the police or died in custody. Like, I think when we had Paul Gilroy on the show, he said that he felt that to some extent his generation had not done enough to make these stories and voices reach our mainstream consciousness of understanding of who we are and what we should still continue to be fighting. Watching what happened after the murder of George Floyd, it was amazing to see so many people energized, but equally from a localized point of view, this stuff isn't necessarily new, and we have very much local stories and violences like this that have been perpetuated by the state onto our communities for decades. And obviously you capture this so well in the book. And yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I feel like a year on for me, I'm just sort of thinking, how do we keep these names? How do we keep these stories in the forefront, or how can we bring them into the forefront?
I went to ICA.
War in Babylon, yeah.
Last week, I went to that. So just holding in mind what you said about, well, how do we keep these histories, tell these histories, let people know that this is what happened, and it's worth saying. It was quite difficult. It's quite difficult. Because Stafford Scott was there, so he was taking us on a tour of the exhibition, and he was talking to these kind of still pictures on the wall. And if you were around in that time, and I was around in that time, then these are quite difficult spaces to reimagine and think about again. And I agree with Paul Gilroy that our generation maybe hasn't done enough, hasn't said enough. But it's actually quite painful, you know. It's actually quite painful to remember some of the everyday practices that, you know, we just experienced on a kind of day-to-day level. And so I suppose that for some of us, once we got to a point where we didn't have to think about it in that way anymore, and changes had been made in terms of legislation and all these kinds of things, that, yeah, maybe, and part of the Terraformed was to try and address a very small part of that, to make those connections between the struggles of the past and the struggles that young people are experiencing now. There's also that kind of migrant perspective, I suppose. My parents came here from somewhere else, and so they come with that perspective that each generation is supposed to do better than the last. And because they'd made this journey and we were here, well, you're English, aren't you? You're born here. And couldn't really get to grips with the idea that actually it was better in some ways, but it was so much more difficult in so many other ways. And knowingly or unknowingly, my generation, the ones that were born and grew up here or came here very young, we kind of did the same thing, that each generation, you're doing better than us because, I don't know, you've got more things, you've got access to more opportunities, it must be better for you. And so coming to that understanding, and that was one of the questions that when I did the online book launch, one of the questions was, well, you know, why didn't we know? Why didn't we know? And these are difficult things to say, difficult spaces to occupy, but I think what's happening now is that we've had the big moments with Black Lives Matter and the protests and whatever, but though that resistance is still going on in different ways, maybe on a smaller scale, and at some point it will all connect together again. That's just me being ever hopeful. It's my natural way of being. I'm sorry, but
we like the hope.
But I think because one of the things that came out of this lockdown period for me was this kind of, well, I say I'm being actively hopeful, but how am I being actively hopeful? So I've been doing some work with a small social enterprise run by a young woman who's only just 20, trying to tackle youth violence in Newham. Newham's got a very it's got some challenges in terms of young people and, you know, how life is for them. And she's really trying to do something about it. So do you want to plug the? It's Your Life, More Life, and
Your Life, More Life.
Your Life, More Life. And so to see this young woman, Shanae Oldham, do all of this stuff, and the board, I don't think any of them are older than 24 or something, and so I do what I can, and I don't think I'm exceptional. That's the point I'm getting to. I don't think I'm exceptional. I don't think I'm unusual. I think there's lots of this going on across the generations in all these different pockets. The thing is that how do we connect it together?
I don't know. I think your presence there, Joy, is the point. Like that's you're a link to a part of British past that they can't really understand, and they will never really understand. But you could, it kind of gives them a kind of context like that. There's a dynamism in young people that I see now, and especially with the kind of the post Black Lives Matter. Like it's there. They're different. Like this football team is different. And like even before we look at even the racial aspect, look how they carry themselves. There's no one getting pissed like Gaza, but these guys carry themselves as true sportsmen, right? Representing what they were, right? About being anti-racist, etc., etc. But these young people seem different, and there's a dynamism. But I think where we plug in is like you have an experience of this country, experience of systems, and you can kind of point them, well, kind of highlight the way to them. Like there's this out there, there's these things out there, and they're quite welcome. They're quite receptive to these kind of things, and I think that's the story. That's the joined up thing. Because when I speak to my dad now, and I'm speaking to my dad about his experience, because I said like when he came over, his mum died on the plane. Oh. So when he arrived, there were 4 kids had to look after themselves now in a foreign country and their kids. But I said there's a success story there somewhere. You've managed to do all this in a foreign country from a child, looking after yourself. Tell me what happened. Tell me your story. And in him telling that story, there's an understanding what the system was and where it is now, and it's understanding that genealogy. Yeah,
I think that's such a good point here, and just sort of bridging those two things that you've just. So your response to me, Joy, about talking about going to war in a Babylon at ICA. Everyone, it's on till September. Make sure you go if you can. Your point about it being like reliving the past and thinking about the past, it being painful. I am so sympathetic, and that's like in response to Paul when he said that. I was like, I just feel like there was so much that went on. There's so much trauma there that we haven't quite dealt with. And then you talking about the conversations you've been able to have with your dad. It is so hard to get that generation to talk about what they went through. Like if you ask like I'll even ask your mum T, or I'll ask my dad. I'll be like, what happened then? He's like, I don't know, don't remember. And it's like there is a trauma there that is hard to talk about because everyday life was so difficult.
But you know what the madness is? I think how I kind of hit with my dad is I explained to him the realness. I say to him like, listen, I'll tell you about my stuff, how it is for me, but on a real. I'm not going to sugarcoat it because you're my dad now. I'm going to tell you how it was. So what we did. I'm not talking about it's the same, but it's similar. I'm talking about my time coming up, where you're talking about your time coming up. And you can kind of share stories. And there's been points where you kind of think, it's similar. Not the same, but it's similar. Yeah. And you're doing similar things. And in me and my dad's case, 2 young black men at different points in time, alone in the system. And you're doing it without your parents, and you're just kind of working your way around. So you're both encountering the police, but at different points in time. You're both encountering the state. You're both working out how to work your way through the system. And so when I'm talking about that, and then it's quite interesting how he sees things, because he's not had the academic side of it. So he's just interpreting it as he's encountering it and for his own reasons. And I think he was involved in Rastafarianism at a young age. So all that comes into it. But then the difference was like you came here and you knew you was a foreigner. But I'm born here and I was told I'm not a foreigner. But yet I've been told I am a foreigner. I said, you know how mad that is? Yeah. I said, it messes your head. Because all the time you encounter people, I don't know anything else. And when I do go back to where you consider home, I definitely don't feel at home there. And even though you're telling me I'm from there, I don't feel like I'm from there. Yeah. So you end up in a funny position where you're thinking, I know I'm from here, but people tell I'm not from here. But when I go back home, I definitely know I don't feel from here. So where am I from?
But you reminded me of in Terraformed when Joy talks about encountering everyday life with a young black man. You talk about that in the book, like what that is like to visualize, but also bear witness to your life. And it makes, like, listening to you talk then, and thinking again about Joy talking about this in Terraform, it just makes me really upset that it is still very much the same.
Yeah, and it was one of the things that one of the panelists said at the book launch that I did, that I think she would have fitted into the class of 91. She just said that it's just the disappointment that it's no different. Some things might be different, but the disappointment. And I think the other unexpected consequence of the Terraformed is one of the things that you're describing, Tiso, which is about finding different ways to frame the question so that we can have those intergenerational conversations that are painful, that can be difficult, because who wants to talk about getting stopped by the police and beaten up in the back of a van? You know, you want to present to your children a form of being that's strong and sorted out and knows what to do and is in control of their life, and you don't want to tell your kids that. You don't want to tell your kids how people treated you. You don't want to tell your children how you were disregarded and treated like a child in front of all of these things. The nicknames. That now people talk about political correctness gone mad. But that was a response to the name calling, that everyday way of speaking to people that made people's lives a misery. There was a reason for it, and so it's trying to find a way of putting those things in context without reliving the trauma, to have the conversations that make those important points about this is how it was for me, and I'm hearing how it is for you, and there's power in that, and we haven't been able to do that as well as we might so far, I think, but we will. I we will when we do.
I think one of the things that I think is that was a barrier was, especially between me and my dad, was the idea of masculinity. So the idea that, for example, when you talk about those names being belittled, he does, for a long time he didn't present that to me, but I said to him, well, that happened to me, and it happened to me, and it felt a bit shit, but it's not a thing you can. I know it must have happened to you because I've seen it happen to other people, and so it's about trying to get past those things that, especially like black masculinity, the idea is to present a certain a strength and no weakness. I think that's a killer for us, man. And
I do think in terms of this kind of the everyday, let's call them microaggressions, negative racialisation, racisms, anti-blackness, how it is socially reproduced within our everyday interactions. It's reminding me of I think what you're talking about in terms of masculinity, yes, but I also think it transcends masculinity as well, because it just prompted me to think of when a few minutes ago Joy said about, I think it was someone on the panel said, why didn't you tell us? It's the thing that came up the most in my intergenerational conversations in my PhD between black parents and their children was, why didn't you tell us?
Listen, I spoke to my mum about this, right? And I spoke to my mum and my dad, and I spoke to one of my aunts, an older, they're probably in their 80s, right? And they said their response, and generally, after speaking to it, is they couldn't put it into words, because they didn't really understand it themselves. And my mum's put a bit more on it. She said, I didn't have the knowledge to explain it to you because I didn't really understand it myself. So you're just going through it and making the best of what you can. For in my mum's case, where she's raising by herself, as best as she can as a single mother. So she's just doing it DIY on the spot as she goes. And she says, I'm just hoping that what I'm putting into you works. So when I started doing my madness and going and doing whatever, she said, I just hoped that what I said to you would stick. And sometimes it did. And sometimes I was just lucky.
Yeah.
I was just lucky. Me and my pals were just lucky.
I liked that Joy mentioned about luck.
Yeah, it's 100%.
What's useful about that? We don't talk about luck enough, do we?
Sometimes you just get a
Listen, you get a blind.
Yeah. And
stand in it.
And it is that thing where people don't say it out loud. They give you the kind of, I did this, I did that, like it was some linear process, and it's not always that way. And I think the point about didn't have the language, I think that sometimes people of that generation, it was shrouded in things like you have to work twice as hard, or those kinds of messages, or make sure you get your receipt, or if you don't know where it came from, put it back, or if you don't know where the person. So the messages were there, but maybe not laid out in this kind of way of, and so we're kind of getting to a point where we are lacing those things together. I think we're lacing those things together, and it will start to make sense. Yeah. And I think that because the sense of belonging that you spoke about, Tiso, because I was born here, you know, my parents came here from Jamaica, but I was born here. I'm the youngest of 5 children. I've only ever lived here. I've only ever lived in London. I've never lived anywhere else. And yet, that sense of belonging, that sense of citizenship is still partial. It's still contingent. And that's the point I was making. The response to the people who missed the penalties. The response to that, which is, we're all on the same team. We're all on our side. We all belong together up until the point that you don't do or behave in a way that we deem fit, and then it can be removed. And I'm going to sound really old now, but it's okay. It was my birthday on Sunday.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, so I went to Brighton for the day because I haven't seen the sea for 18 months. I haven't seen the sea for 18 months. I thought, yeah, we'll go to Brighton. So, you know, road trip, we get on a train, we're going to Brighton. But we'd planned that before realising that the finals were going to be on that day. I didn't know. And who told me to wear a red and white tracksuit? So there I am in my red and white colours, heading down. And it was fine going down, but coming back, all the trains were cancelled because most of the drivers had disappeared. So it took a long time to come back. By the time I get to Stratford, people are coming home now, aren't they, from the game that hasn't gone well. And it really was like being in the 1970s.
Really?
The vibe, it was a feeling of, and then the language starts. And so I thought, usually I would walk from Stratford to my house, and I thought, I'm going to get on this bus. I'm not going to walk. I'm going to get on this bus. And I got on the bus, and a young black woman got on behind me, and she was raging. She was talking to somebody on her phone, and somebody had called her names, so she was going to shoved her out of the way and called her names on the station, and she was so angry. And then she was upset. So she's telling her friend, and that mixture of rage and upset, and it just took me back to being 18 or 19 again, where, because she was saying, I should have spun her. I shouldn't have just left it like that. She was so upset because this person called her names, and when she challenged her, I didn't mean you. So then you think, I've made a mistake. So all of those thoughts, and because she was saying all of this out loud, and I was just sitting there and thinking, we can't go back here. We can't go back here. We can't be in those places again. And if we continue on the road, we're talking about authoritarian populism. If we continue on this road that we're on, that's where we're going, or that's maybe where we are now. And I'm just being a bit ignorant to it, but it was a horrible, horrible feeling. Horrible feeling. I
experienced what you kind of talk about, Joy. I was angry. I was so angry about that we were in this space, that the team that were playing represented the England, there was 2 Englands there. The team that was playing was representing the England that we want to see, that we're talking about here. But the crowd, the nation, was the England of the past. And it's funny that this game of football had evolved into the directions of this, where we want this nation to be. It's no longer about the game. It's
another
anymore.
proxy, but I think we've got a variety of these. Like, obviously, this podcast is Republican through and through, but you see the proxies of the Euros, of Harry and Meghan, of like all these different kind of popular. Like, the 3 of us are all very interested in popular culture and how that plays out within how nationalism is organised. These things are important. Yeah, they become proxies of what we're up against.
But you see, and it's in the kind of that pithy catchphrase that breaks it, like to go back to what they want to go back to, but is this what you want to go back to?
Yeah.
And for me, it makes me feel so angry, because in my own case, and probably all of us, we've studied your canon, we've read we know it back to front, but yet you won't even give us a chance, man. Like, that's what upsets me. And you're claiming that you know your country, you love your country.
You don't know it.
You don't know it. You don't know it. I know it from my point of view, but also your point of view. But you're not even willing to listen to what I have to say. Like, just stop doing this.
Stop talking.
Just stop.
Stop talking. Stop talking. Stop talking. Black Lives Matter. Stop talking.
But yeah,
stop talking.
It made me so angry. But any black person I spoke to, the response, everyone like, you knew it was gonna come.
Yeah.
Any black person you spoke to.
I couldn't watch. So I didn't watch. I didn't watch the penalty. I do very much like football. Hands in the air. But equally, as soon as I saw who was taking the penalties, I was like,
it's game over.
It's game over. Stuff.
It was bizarre because I was travelling back, and so this was happening as a kind of moving picture. Every train station we stopped at, you could hear the cheers or not from the crowd outside, and then it was getting darker and darker, literally darker because the light was fading, but the feeling was getting more and more somber as you went along. So what started off as a kind of afternoon in the sun, people happy, and it just, and so yeah, by
the rain started,
then the rain started to come. So by then it was a movie I didn't want to be in.
It was a madness.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
But like I said to you, if you spoke to any black person, they would say it's obvious. You could feel it coming, right?
Yeah.
I was traveling, but during the happy point, I was moving around, and people being so happy to me, and I can see people, but there's a kind of a venom that sits behind that happiness. So when I'm hearing them being happy and they're not being joyous, they're smashing stuff up. I was in Chingford. People I know are naked. And I'm like, bro.
Listen.
But again, and I'm trying to explain to him now. I said, do you understand what I mean by white privilege? I said, look, if I took my clothes off in the street, I'm getting sectioned or put in prison. And I'm like, that's a madness.
How did we go?
It's my fault. It's my fault.
Yeah,
I brought up football and banter and laddish. But is it laddish? But yeah. But and what behaviour is acceptable and sanctioned depending on who does it. And how literally the shape, the sound, the tone of something can change within. It was a couple of hours, wasn't it, from start to finish. And then within minutes, we have the kind of racial slurs come back. So, yeah.
But it's the fact that people are shocked. Like my man's people say, I'm shocked. And then when you look at some of the responses, they say, I thought he was a normal guy. What do you mean? Like, this is standard. This is normal. Like, yeah.
Well, one of the things that surprised me the most was how Terraformed has been taken up. And so A-level geography.
Lovely.
Imagine.
Yeah.
I can imagine.
I can imagine.
I can imagine.
There's an anti-racist geography curriculum group, and they've looked at it. They've made these suggestions where you can link different parts of the book to different bits of the syllabus. I thought, and then I did this talk at a secondary school in Newham, and they've adopted it for their year 7s. Again, geography, and it's for and also as part of their bigger picture, looking at how to decolonise the geography curriculum by looking at Terraformed. So that was that.
Oh, big up, Joy. Come on, Terraformed. I'm not astonished. That's the way it should be. That's incredible, but equally, like, we shouldn't be surprised because it's written so clearly and it connects so many things. Like, there must be kids reading it being like, oh, yeah.
But I think from when you're in the end, I think you encounter geography, but you don't think it is that. So I'm from this part of the flats. Yeah. So when I first started going out, you could only play on the top floor. You can't go downstairs. So there's geographies of boundaries and understanding certain spaces, but you don't understand it as such. You just know, I can't go to that. I can't go across the road. I can't go to those block of flats.
Yeah.
Or I can't go to that postcode because for whatever reason.
Oh, Joy, thank you so much for joining us. That was absolutely brilliant. What a privilege to have you on again.
Joy,
can
big,
we bring on next year? Joy, annual Joy, white reasoning. Love it.
Yeah. It was, it was, because I don't think, until I spoke to the two of you, I don't think I'd done a podcast before.
Oh, really?
I don't think so. I'm trying to remember. I don't think so. And then after that, it was one of my favourite things to do. So
good,
and I was listening more often afterwards as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Joy, and thank you, listeners, for continuing to support us.
You can take them off. You can take them off. You can take them off.
Thank you for continuing to support us. You'll notice that the episodes each week, we're not necessarily following a clear-cut pattern, but you are over the summer getting a combination of the Reflection series and also the main Surviving Society episodes. So yeah, thank you so much, and we'll see you again soon.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the T's and C's with Tisa and Chantel. You can now continue the conversation with us on Twitter and Instagram.